All right, Ben, I know we talked a little bit before, but still, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, so my name is Ben Jones. I'm currently leading the sports science department at Indiana University. I also serve as athletic performance coach with the men's tennis program. Prior to being at IU, I've bounced around the country like most people in this space have from time to time. So I was with the Oklahoma City Thunder for a little while. I was at Tulane working with football and a few other sports. I taught for a year during COVID at Southern Miss. I ran a private training business in Brooklyn. So we've definitely been kind of all over. Bellarmine University in Louisville as well was a good stop for us. So, pretty diverse background as far as it pertains to performance science, but also strength conditioning as well.
Nice, nice. So before we dive into like the topics we want to talk about today, just a question, like, you like sports science more or like strength training more?
Yeah, that's the question I get asked all the time, and I always hate to be this guy, but I really love both, and I feel like they really work in sync. You really can't be a strength coach without being a sports scientist to some degree. Now that could go the other way around. You can be a sports scientist without necessarily being a strength coach, and that happens. We have people come into this space from athletic training and from data science and from physical therapy. We have all kinds of routes that kind of wind up specializing in sports science and performance science. But yeah, I really love both. And for me, it's really important to keep both of those tools kind of sharp.
Nice, nice. Because I feel like nowadays, like in our field, like performance training, you need to understand like load management, GPS, force plate. Otherwise, like, I don't mean that you don't know how to program training, but you kind of need to understand all those stuff, right?
Yeah, I think if you're a strength coach and let's say you're not a sports scientist per se, you're not planning the court loads for basketball, for example, you still need to understand, kind of what training has looked like so that what you're doing in the weight room can supplement that. Because ultimately, everything we do in the weight room and in the training room is just to support performance on the court or on the field. So if you don't have some sort of understanding and there's not good communication going on between those high performance pillars, then yeah, some stuff's going to fall through the cracks and you might double up on some intensities on days that maybe it wasn't a good idea to do that, or you miss a training window where they were light in practice and you had an opportunity to kind of supplement that with a higher volume or higher intensity session in the weight room. But because their communication wasn't there, maybe you kind of missed your window. So, yeah, I think it's a skill set that is becoming increasingly important in the strength conditioning space as well.
Nice, nice. So I know you also graduated from University of Louisville,
Yeah,
right?
I did.
So, uh, and last year, correct me if I'm wrong, but last year you also taught master degree student about athlete management and data management. Am I correct?
Yeah, athlete monitoring and data. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So here goes my first question.
Okay.
So, and one of the reason I ask this because we nowadays like everybody use probably every D1 school or like every sport use like GPS data and force plate, but like so all the strength coaches use it, but we are kind of talk about like the science behind the numbers, like the basic force time curve load management. Then I realized actually not the coaches understand those stuff. Like they just
Yeah,
look at the numbers. They don't even understand force time curves. I'm like, what the?
yeah.
But so I want to start by like asking, like, you're like, okay, so from women's basketball to men's basketball to men's soccer, like
Mhm.
from a GPS standpoint, like do the metric you track kind of the same or like how different will it be?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, definitely sport to sports can look very different. We know basketball is, primarily lateral, but it does have that vertical aspect to it. So, we don't track jumps necessarily when it comes to men's soccer, but we do track them. We kind of lump them into what we call a measure of called high intensity actions. And I think in years following, we'd like to break that down a little bit more and specifically looking at accelerations, decelerations, change of directions, and jumps in the high bands at least, and kind of look at them a little bit more separately. But right now, just for the sake of simplicity and making sure that coaches can kind of get an idea of the general intensity of the session, we've kind of lumped them into something that we call high intensity actions. So we can include jumps in that for basketball, whereas in men's soccer, we do not include that, partially because it's just not a big part of the game. It's pretty much a wide open field with a lot of linear acceleration and high speed running distance and change of direction, but also just because the polar product that we currently have doesn't support that y axis, so to speak. So
Nice, nice. So, can you kind of like like share with us like what metric exactly like you guys track on like just GPS data?
yeah, so for basketball, for example, we use Catapult, so we rely on player load. We feel that it is it's highly correlated with distance covered. So sometimes it's easier for a coach to kind of see one number of all movement and kind of understand the total volume. And then we also look at high intensity actions, like I said. So with those two sports right now, that's kind of what we're really focusing on, are player load and high intensity actions. And that way the coach can see here's how much total movement occurred during the training session, which would be the player load, and then how much of, comparatively to a game, how many high intensity actions were done. You can go obviously going into minute by minute, player load per minute, high intensity actions per minute. But if the coaches can just look at that and within 5 seconds have a pretty good understanding, as we use kind of a conditionally formatted color chart from green to red, compared to a game load, essentially. It's a good measure for us for where we are right now as a department.
So, uh, when it comes to soccer, is that like kind of the same metrics you guys track?
Yeah, so with men's soccer, I will say I think we've just again just currently in our department, we've currently been working with them for a little bit longer. Coaches have a pretty good understanding of the metrics we're looking at, and they're very curious and ask a lot of questions. So we, with men's soccer, track four KPIs, and that is total distance, high speed running distance, which I think for us is anything maybe 14 miles an hour and above. I'd have to take a look at that, or 12 miles an hour. And then we also look at high intensity accelerations and high intensity decelerations. And that's really, really useful for us because for men's soccer, for example, we'll be pretty often where we'll go and assign a weekly cap. And that's kind of we'd like to be plus or minus 10% of this for the team average for the week. And we kind of base that on the previous weeks leading up to that. So we obviously use the acute to chronic workload ratio, but sometimes it's easy for a coach to see, it's Wednesday after training. We've got 2 more days of training left, and we are at 70% of our high speed running distance for the week. So just kind of keeping them accountable, making sure they're aware of where we're at. And that just helps us be a little bit more proactive than reactive so that if we are at Tuesday with 5 days left of training or games and we're at 70% of our high speed running, it's like, okay, we might want to modify the following days a little bit from what we originally had planned. And we really like that. It allows us the ability to, open up practice a little bit if we're really high on the mechanical load of the accels and decels, and we need to get a little bit more distance in high speed running and fill that bucket. Or likewise, if we're really high on the distances and we're not getting a lot of change of direction, then we might do some smaller sided games and go 4v4 for a good amount of training versus 11v11.
Nice, nice. So, uh, this is a stupid one, but like,
No, no stupid questions.
why,
Questions.
like, you already tr like basketball, you already track player load or like player load per minute.
Mhm.
Why, like, how many acceleration and how many like high intensity deceleration?
Yeah, no, not a stupid question at all. Because they're just different loads on the body. And so, we talk about fatigue. Obviously, the accels and decels are fatiguing, but I'm especially concerned with the high band decelerations when it comes to soft tissue injuries. So, as a sports science department, we really have two goals when it comes to athlete monitoring, and they kind of straddle the top and bottom end of that acute to chronic, if that's something that you really utilize. And that is A, we want to make sure that we obviously do everything we can to reduce the likelihood of injury. And of course, we can't fully, prevent injury. I hate the term injury prevention, but we can do whatever we can to stack the cards as well as we can in our favor to reduce the likelihood of it. But sports unpredictable, injuries are going to happen from time to time. The second part of that, though, is performance optimization. And I feel like that's something that usually slips through the cracks of people's understanding when they think about sports science. They see ESPN articles about load management, and they think that we're just here to be the hall patrol saying, "Hey, you're going too fast. You got to slow down." Whereas quite often, I'm looking at things and I'm seeing starters might be doing pretty well right now. They might be, maintaining week to week, but we've got low minute players that are actually detraining week to week, and we need to maybe intervene there some way and get them some top up work to make sure that we don't lose fitness should, one of those injuries occur out of the blue and somebody, let's say men's soccer, for example, goes from not playing at all to becoming a 60-minute player. We need to make sure that they're ready for that, not only to prevent the likelihood or reduce the likelihood that they'll get injured once they kind of get that big workload spike, but also so that they're not, fatigued at minute 45 and they perform like crap for the next 15 minutes. We want to win games too. So it's not just about, keeping the player healthy, which is obviously our first priority, but second to that, the success on the field is going to, depend on their physical capacity to perform what their mind's telling their body to do.
Nice, nice. So, um, can you also share like what is it like to like break down those numbers or data to coaches,
Yeah.
to like sport coaches, and at the same time, like how do you break down those numbers to like strength coaches? Or is it like a meeting with both of them, or you have to like meet individually?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, every staff and every team is going to digest information and communicate a little bit differently. So that is probably just being in my position now has been one of my biggest challenges because it's hard enough to do that with one staff and one roster, but then you have 23 sports and a lot of them previously didn't have a lot of this kind of tracking or information being shared. So a lot of that early on was just sort of taking inventory and like getting to know them and finding out what they like and what they don't like. So we might have one team that wants a daily report with, 3 pages worth of tables and figures, and they want, lengthy recommendations, and they want us to, plan the training loads for the day and everything. And then there's other teams that, maybe want a weekly report or they don't really read their email. So you have to just deliver the information face to face. And a lot of that's just kind of finding out, what the coach's communication style is. I think one of my goals here, kind of to touch your point of, meeting separately or meeting together, I think that sending out separate reports to different kind of knowledge bases, like physiologically, is good. But I do think that having those joint meetings or joint email threads or whatever it is, where everyone on staff's included and they're all seeing the same information at the same time, I think that's really, really valuable. So, again, one of the functions I think we can best serve as a department is to kind of break down the barriers and the pillars between the pillars of high performance. And we can kind of organize meetings, we can lead discussions, we can ask questions, and just start to get everybody's input. So sometimes that's as easy as just meeting with the team for the first time and finding out that they don't actually do any kind of frequent recurring all staff meetings where the strength coach, the AT, the dietitian, and the sport coaches are actually in the same room discussing the week and the plans for the week and bouncing ideas off of each other. I think those discussions are really, really valuable. So I hope that answered your question. I feel like that was a bit of a rant, but
No, 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 it's good. It's good. Because it's not gonna be like exactly what you want in our field. It's never
yeah.
gonna be like that.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest skills you can kind of develop if you're like an aspiring sports scientist is the ability to compromise and to come to like, to middle ground with people. Because, you and I know same thing in strength conditioning, you have a textbook definition, plan of like this is the most optimal way that we'll train and we'll do this time, 3 times a week at this intensity for this many reps and we'll track it this way. And then rather than getting 3 or 4 times a week with a team, you'll get 2 times a week in season, and then a lift gets canceled, and you have to kind of adjust on the fly and kind of find that middle ground of, getting as close to your goal as possible, given what the circumstances you're put in.
Mm. So again, I'm gonna dumb it down a little bit. So from your perspective, like how can like you mentioned, everybody probably every sport coach hate the word load management right now, and the
Yeah,
strength coach.
I don't like I don't really like the term either, just because it's so misunderstood. I don't even use it. But yeah,
Yeah, so like I'm gonna dumb it down anyway,
yeah,
because in I feel like in our field there's still a lot of like strength coaches, performance coaches, kind of don't understand like this. Yeah, whatever. I'm still gonna use it. Load management concept.
sure,
So
yeah,
if we're let's just use soccer as a as an example, if we're
Sure.
gonna work back from the sport, like how would you help them plan? Maybe use GPS or not use GPS to plan or help the coach understand the concept and quote unquote load management.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Are we talking about like kind of starting from an off season, how we're going to start planning the
Yep,
year?
yep, yep.
Yes. So, I mean, there's probably different ways to approach this. For me, we got to start from assuming they're at zero because you can't really control what athletes are doing in June. We have no idea. You can give them packets, but ultimately we're not really, keeping track of that. So we have to kind of assume the worst. And then it's basically looking at, for me, it's like the first week of preseason, especially if you have historical data, go back and look at those first couple weeks of preseason and think like, okay, that's our first goal. That's kind of our medium, short to medium term goal. We have to get them from zero to that. So, what's a safe way to progress that so that we don't see too big of a workload spike and it's too big of a stress to their system and they're able to recover and adapt to it? So, that's kind of my first goal. And then from there, I go back again retroactively and I look at kind of the worst case scenario game weeks from the year prior. And so, if you can kind of get an average of maybe your two biggest weeks, that's your next goal. So, how do you get from zero to that first week of training camp or preseason? And then from there, how do we progress even further to make sure that they're ready for that worst case scenario game week? And again, making sure that we do that in the most progressive but somewhat conservative way possible. And then from there, you go back and you see the schedule. Okay, so we need to accomplish all this, and we've got three trainings a week, or maybe at first we're at 8 hours, and we've only got 2 weeks, 2 days a week of training. So how do we get that? Do we need to plan some of those loads for practice and then divvy some of that up with like post lift conditioning with the strength coach, or how can we get some of those distance, some of those accelerations and decelerations, and just kind of again being able to take the information from all the different ways and view it from like 30,000 feet to make sure that you're accounting for all those factors. From there, create your plan, present it to the coach, hope that they receive it well. And then, I mean, that's honestly, that's the easy part, right? It sounds complicated, but once you get the plan in place, it's adjusting that plan as you go because it's never going to go exactly to plan. So being able to utilize all the tools we use for athlete monitoring means that we have to reassess the situation every single day and make new decisions based on the new information.
So without these like contexts,
Yeah.
it's probably if you like all right, if you don't understand like the concept of like load management or like the context of the sport or
hmm
what we just talked about, it's probably meaningless just looking at those numbers, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, numbers are numbers. It's kind of one of those questions. I used to, for a brief time post grad, I worked in ergonomics. So I was basically doing, biomechanics analysis and force testing with like industrial line workers, right? So this was kind of like during a weird little 8 month stretch post grad. And at the time, I thought it was the most boring thing in the world, right? I didn't think I'm going to take any of this into my, what I really want to do. And now I look back and I'm like, we do the same thing in sport, because we would present to engineers and we would say, we have a 15-pound weight here, or we ask them, what is the heaviest weight that an operator is what we call them. What's the heaviest weight an operator can lift? And people would be 50 pounds, 100 pounds, 20 pounds. And the answer is it depends, right? It depends on what they're lifting the weight from and the height. How often in a day are they going to have to lift that weight? Where are they going to put that weight once they pick it up? Like you have to be able to take in all the factors to see the situation like from a 360-degree angle, to really come up with an answer of like what is a safe number to assign to that. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to, load. If I say, what's the most distance we can run tomorrow, and that's the only question you come and ask me as a coach, I'm going to say, okay, well, how much have they been running lately? What did they do today? What did they do yesterday? I really need a lot more context before I can give you an answer for that. And sometimes that's a frustrating, response for coaches. But, thankfully here I have all that context. So, in that scenario, it's not really super applicable, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you need the context around it to make the decision, and the context changes every day. So having somebody that has the ability to what I like to call untangle the Christmas lights, that feels like what we do a lot of every day is untangling Christmas lights to come up with these, very simple and easy to digest recommendations for coaches that are going to kind of keep our athletes, performing at their best.
Nice, nice. So, uh, we work at college settings, so there's a 8 hour to 20 hour period.
Mhm.
So if we go back to like talk about load management and weekly, like how to progress the load from week to week. So how do you handle the 8 hour to like 20 hour that spike of the load?
Yeah, I really like to lean on the strength coaches, and make them aware of what we need to accomplish because I don't think, if you're trying to get from, in you have two trainings a week and then you're going to four, and you need them to get from 1,000 player load arbitrarily to 4,000 player load in a week. Like that's not a good plan, right? If we know every training is going to be about 500 player load or something like that. So I like to lean on them. I like to say, hey, like if this is the distance we're expecting to see them at, this is the amount of high speed running we expect to see them at, in a couple of weeks when we go to 20 hours. Here's where they're currently at. So when we bring them into the weight room or we get them post practice, like speaking with the coaches, is there a way that we can supplement and start ramping stuff up if we don't feel like we hit enough high speed running for the day after practice? Can we do some build ups or some box to box runs? Or, when their strength coach gets them in the weight room the next day, is there possible that we can maybe get some post lift runs in, out on the football field right outside the weight room? Whatever it is we can do to kind of manipulate those loads. It is tough when you go, especially if it's like a 2 to 4 kind of training thing. If it's a 2 to 3, it's a little bit more manageable, but 2 to 4 is kind of a big jump, or even 2 to 5. So, yeah, just trying to guide that as best as possible. And there's inevitably probably going to be some kind of spike there. It's almost like we said, you can have a textbook plan and you can say like, I'd like to do this, but some of it's just not realistic. And you're going to say, well, it's probably going to be a 25% increase week to week, but you know what? It could have been 50 if we didn't go and make these measures and try to, minimize that spike as best we could. So some of it's just, making the best with what you got.
Well, the rule is the rule. There's definitely gonna be a huge spike.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's almost unpreventable, but again, it depends on how good a relationship you have with coaches. Are they willing to, add some supplemental stuff? Are they willing to change the way they train and the practice script the week before, the weeks leading up to maybe, facilitate that increase a little bit? All that stuff is really crucial if you have good relationships with them.
Nice, nice. So I'm gonna go to like jump outside the force sorry, GPS topic.
Yeah.
So the next thing I want to ask is like since you guys also use ForcePlate to track your athletes, so what kind of metrics you guys track for like just those three teams?
Yeah. So I mean, we kind of look at it from two ways. So I think force plates are often, just bucketed as a weight room tool for longitudinal like performance, improvements and all that stuff. It is, extremely valuable. I say that's probably the primary use of them. But with athlete monitoring, again, kind of seeing their status day to day, it's a really, really valuable tool. If you have something that you can look at, their training numbers, but then you can objectively compare that to, how explosive are they day to day, and we can, pick up signs and indicators of neuromuscular fatigue on the force plate. So RSI mod is a big one for us when we come to athlete monitoring. So we have our teams jump at least 3 times a week. Ideally, if they're going to play home competitions, we would have them jump maybe 2 days. If they lift the other 2 days in training or post training or whatever, we'll get 2 jumps then. And then if they're going to do any kind of home competition, we want to get the jump pregame as well, maybe right after some kind of standardized dynamic warm up. And then we can compare the game day jumps to the non-game day jumps. And ideally, you want the game day jumps to be higher with RSI, right? We want them to be at their most explosive on game day. And if that's not the case, and it's kind of hard to do really without it being a kind of a red flag to me, because naturally, like if we jump it at half court in Assembly Hall pregame for basketball, right? So by that point, 60 minutes to tip off. We got fans in the stands, not a lot, but the fans are starting to trickle in a little bit. The lights are on, they're in their uniforms. So naturally, I feel like that adrenaline is just going to give them a little more oomph when it comes to explosiveness on the plates. So if we actually see that they're like less explosive on the force plates, for example, on a game day, that to me is like a big red flag, because that's not very common. You will see that, at least from my experience to this point. And we had a case of this recently with an athlete who, we look at it from a bunch of different ways. So when it came to their workloads for a number of reasons, They had a kind of a rapid increase in workload. So we were using the acute to chronic. They were maybe in what I would call like the orange to red for a couple of days that week. Their wellness numbers that we get, which I think is really, really valuable, were indicating that they were sore and they were stressed and they were tired. And then the force plate matched that where they actually had a worse game day jump than a non-game day typically is, which is pretty significant percentage decrease for this athlete. So all those things are just kind of screaming the same information to me where I felt like it was like important to bring that to the coach's attention just so they're aware of the situation. Ultimately, they make the decisions. You know, if they ask me for a recommendation or if they welcome that, I'll make the recommendation on how we can maybe address that given the schedule ahead for the next week. But at least they're aware of the situation and maybe that can match the coach's eye in terms of what they saw from the athlete in the game that day.
Nice, nice. So, how often do you guys jump your athletes?
I mean, again, for if we're going to do it for athlete monitoring purposes, 2 to 3 times a week would be minimum. Like one time a week doesn't give you a lot of context. It's good to know, but 2 or 3 times a week, ideally, kind of spaced out throughout the week.
And f with force plate and GPS data, do you think that kind of like those numbers kind of match like what you would think it would be? Or like,
Yeah, for the most part, it's not very common that I'll say like if we're talking about like the fatigue standpoint, you know, yeah, it's not very common that I'll see an athlete that's like been burning in the red, like, oh, we really need to pull back here. Like the numbers are a little concerning. And I didn't see some kind of indicator of it on the force plates, you know? And obviously the force plate's one of the biggest factors there is motivation and effort, right? Otherwise, that those explosiveness, especially like the RSI, is kind of useless. And so we really do a good job of cueing every time, like, hey, this matters because you do it the same way every time, even if you're tired. Just give me the best you got. And we really cue that to try to ensure that it's at least as accurate as it possibly could be. But yeah, it's pretty rare that I'll see someone that I would, you know, definitely be wanting to bring it to the coach's attention, and I don't see some kind of indicator from it, whether it's on the wellness data or it's on the force plate. If it's on both, then again, I think you got 3 red flags going up, and it's worthy of having a conversation.
nice. So, just asking this just out of curiosity, because I think last year we had a guy that as player load keeps going up, like there's one or two players, their jump height, their RSI is just not dropping. They're like keep going. I'm like, what are they like? How this happening? Like
Yeah.
everybody's just dropping. Like, did that ever happen to you?
So jump height is a little different than RSI from my experience, and correct me if you've heard differently, but with RSI, that's going to just basically show us the jump strategy. So it's not so much about the output because I think even when you're a little fatigued, you may have like a slower eccentric portion of the jump, but you'll still get the same jump height at the end of the day, or maybe plus or minus 5-10%, nothing super significant. Whereas RSI is usually a lot more, indicative of fatigue. So that's why we rely on that. If we're seeing jump heights drop throughout the season, that's something that we kind of look at separately. It's not one of our primary views. I think that's something more to bring up with the weight room. I think that maybe that's something to have a discussion with the strength coach about. But as it pertains to just like, readiness and availability and again, physical capacity, I definitely rely a lot more on RSI.
Nice, nice. So, can I also share like some of like maybe your conversation with the coaches that sometimes you think like maybe the training need to like modify? How do you bring this up to the coaches? Because like sport coaches probably, I don't know, as far as I know, a lot of sport coaches think like that the player's not fit enough, they're
Yeah,
not running
yeah,
enough, like they're
definitely.
not explosive enough.
Yeah.
So how do you like kind of bring this up to the coaches and help them kind of understand what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think, like a meeting at the beginning of the season to kind of lay out exactly what they're going to be seeing in the reports and what type of recommendations they might see is a good way to kind of get them, have an understanding before. So again, being a little bit more proactive with your communication, I think is really good. And then again, it just depends on the coach. So like right now, I'll have reports that I send out, let's say for basketball, for example, where one or two players, I'm kind of raising awareness about something that I think maybe is an overwork issue, if you want to call it that. And then there might be one or two players on there that I'm actually saying, hey, these two are not doing quite enough, and we need to figure out a way to kind of bridge that gap. So whether it's, those two players are going to take less reps of certain drills in practice, and these two players are going to get some additional reps, or these two players are going to get some supplemental work after training, or if we know that they're not going to play on game day, perhaps after shooting around in the morning, they can stay and get a little bit more work in. There's a lot of ways you can kind of tackle that, but again, I think it's understanding the coach's communication style. Some coaches don't like to hear the word tired, like never use the word tired with them, right? Um, and it's understandable, like from a coach's standpoint, especially if you've been doing something a certain way for decades now, you have a mentality and there's stigmas attached to, being tired with being weak. But, you and I both know that, human bodies, you can at some point, like I don't know if you've ever done like a marathon or anything like that, but I used to run marathons and I can tell you on a number of occasions, I'd be at mile 22 and my brain's thinking, 750-mile pace, but my legs are thinking like 9-minute mile pace, right? Because as much as I will my mind to do it, my body just simply can't do it anymore. So there's a certain point where like you understand that, human beings are not machines. There's ways that we can make them more resilient through like, informed training and informed increases of workload and things like that. But we can't just on a dime expect them to just suddenly handle 75% more than they've been accustomed to in the months prior to that and expect them not to have some negative consequences, whether that's injury or whether that's just the inability of the body to keep up with it and perform well on the court or on the field.
Nice, nice. And I'm also glad that you brought up resilience. So from from a load management standpoint, from a strength coach perspective, s-
Mhm.
or from sports science perspective, how
Yeah.
do you like if you're gonna build like the tissue resilient or the tissue tolerance for let's say in season basketball in season, I don't know about soccer, but basketball in season there's like 2 game per week and there's travel with it
Yeah.
and like they're constantly tired with practice, all those stuff. You gotta lift, you gotta jump, whatever. So, like, how do you like build up the tissue resilient? I know you can already kind of answer that, but yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of playing the sport, and then it's that in combination with the weight room. I think it is really really big. And then third to that, that shouldn't be overlooked is recovery, right? So I think again, getting everyone in the same room, the AT, the strength coach, the sport coach, making a plan for the athlete to increase, all those stresses. And I think like even bucketing a little bit too. Like I don't know if you've like the quadrant system, like Daniel Bove, like I really
yep,
like the way that he breaks that up into like
great
neural
stuff,
stress and physical and tissue
great
stress.
stuff.
Like, that's all that stuff is important to look at holistically. So if we are on the same page of being resilient, that means that can mean a lot of different things. But again, like you wouldn't just go run 10 miles a day to be a basketball player, right? There's stopping on a dime, there's change of directions, there's jumping. We need to make sure that we're accounting for all the tasks that they're going to need to perform in their sport in the volume they're going to need to perform in their sport. So if it's somebody that's starting out with no wearables whatsoever, I understand the struggle with that. Like that is a really tricky one to kind of work into, but at least you can reference some articles and start to like understand like what we found is the norm and then figure out a way that you can maybe bucket activities into certain intensities that you think we start with we build up to like a moderate to high volume of the lower to moderate intensity exercises and then we start to increase some high intensity exercises and over time we increase the volume of those high intensity exercises and then we start to kind of block our days of like this is going to be a high intensity emphasis day and then this is going to be a lower intensity emphasis day and try to bucket it that way. If you had no way to quantify this stuff whatsoever, you can at least make an attempt to, you know, choose what the primary objective of is with training that day.
Nice, nice. So, we talk about force split metrics. We talk about GPS or catapult metrics. So when you send out those like reports for coaches,
Mhm.
do you kind of like combine those or like you just send out like catapult load
Oh yeah.
player load?
Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah. For me, that's super important because I want the coach to get again, that 360-degree view and be able to, read the report and get the takeaways within like 10 to 15 seconds. Because from my experience, like there are coaches where you might not even get 15 seconds of their attention span. So you got to make that report super easy to understand, very intuitive, shiny, and whatever it is that they need. So yeah, with that, I'll send out the report. The one thing for us that was really big this year, last year we had everything was kind of separated. We had Power BI is what we were doing all the reporting in. You can connect the different pieces, but we had no API set up, so there was a lot of manual export and import from different wearables and different force plate systems. And, we weren't really able to get wellness data because all we had was like a Microsoft form, and then we had to export that data and connect it. And it was just super, super time consuming. But now, thankfully, we invested and we're a Teamwork school, and now we've got a Smartabase addition to that. So now we have API set up with Vauld, with Elite Form for our velocity-based training stuff as well, our Catapult stuff. And so we pull all that into a dashboard, and I really like to combine all those metrics to tell the story so that they can see, do all these things tell the same story, or are we good in two areas, but for some reason the wellness is they're reporting some fatigue or something, or likewise everything is high, but the wellness is saying, they feel great. So, all that stuff needs to be taken into account because, we may feel like this is a safe increase or a decrease or whatever, but the athlete's responding really well to it. So maybe we're not going to panic just yet, we'll give it another day. So being able to tell all that story from different views in the same like 1 or 2 page report, super, super valuable.
Nice. So is it like you're gonna pick one or two metrics from each technology, or just one for each?
Yeah, so like for basketball, for example, we'll do player load, high intensity actions as our primary two for now. And then we'll have the kind of the team average for like RSI from the force plates underneath. And then we'll have the daily wellness for the team averages below that. So we'll rank that on like a 1 to 5 score for rest, stress, and soreness. And then we'll have like the previous 7 days on like a trend for each of those lines so they can see, have we been in the green? Are we dipping down into the red? Or are we recovering? It's just great for them to be able to just visualize those three pieces of information at the same time.
Nice, great. That's great stuff. So, uh, all right. So from sports science perspective or strength coach, whatever, if we're like, um, how am I gonna ask this? So, if we're gonna, I'll start by asking this.
Okay.
Since we're, since like you mentioned, you're gonna like cooperate, work with so many numbers, so many technologies,
Mhm.
like, do you have to spend a lot of time like writing like R, Python, those stuff?
You could, yeah. I mean, if I think we're lucky to have Smartabase. I do have experience with R. When I was with the Thunder, we were kind of transitioning to R for all of our reporting, so I learned some of those skill sets. But we had Power BI last year. I think that's a really good tool for coaches. And this may be a hot take, but I feel like Power BI is a really, really good option for your reporting simply because maybe not necessarily for refreshing the data and getting that all up to date. Maybe that's a little bit more manual, but I do feel like the way it's so personalized, you're able to add pictures and color, and I think it's a really simplistic way for coaches again because I'm a big believer you've got maybe 10 seconds of their attention, so you need to maximize that and you need to make it the most easy to understand report that they've ever seen. So I feel like sometimes the R and Python type of visuals maybe look a little bit more like they belong in like a research article. And I don't know if that's necessarily the most effective way to deliver information to coaches. So, yeah,
Mm,
I think that those are extremely good skill sets to have. I think it's probably becoming more and more important in the sports science field as the years go on, and things get more competitive, and we try to dive a little bit deeper into some of these things that are a little bit more finite. So, yeah, I think it's a great skill to have.
nice. So, I think the other question is, since nowadays, like probably every strength, not every, but probably a lot like strength coaches, they work with pro setting, or like us work with pl college athlete. We
Mhm.
all have like GPS data, force plate, velocity based training,
Yeah.
like sometimes even heart rate monitoring
Mhm.
whatsoever. Like the term sports science, I think somehow is kind of like embedded with it's kind of like you have to have these knowledge as a strength
Yeah.
coach nowadays.
Yeah.
So, uh, what do you think is the future for like the sports scientist?
Yeah, I think so. For me, the advantage of having a dedicated sports science resource versus, let's say that every sport here that has a wearable, their strength coach is going to handle all that. First, so here we don't just do that. We're involved in a lot of other processes. We do weight room testing. We do VO2 max testing. We do a lot of other things like body composition, things like that as well. But aside from that, I feel like the strength coach is got enough on their plate in terms of handling programming, individualizing everything, implementing those training programs, being at practice, running warm up, working on the side with rehab athletes, that I don't feel like the attention can like the wearables, for example, or getting deep into the data to create reports that are um, all encompassing is something that is like realistic for a strength coach to be able to do. So for example, um, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like we're able to devote like a fair amount of time to not only, keeping up the current research to maybe come up with new things that we can implement and new things we want to try and maybe change some processes, but we're also able to, really dive deep into the data, untangle all those Christmas lights, and come up with really, really solid recommendations separate from just the weight room. So, I'm not saying that there are not a lot of strength coaches that could do that justice, but I do think that they're typically short on time. When it comes to tagging, that's what I was going to talk about. So tagging, I think, is really, really important too.
Yeah.
We have an informatics intern coming in now as a sports science intern that I think is going to be really cool for us. We're going to start blending the performance data with the way that we've been tagging everything. So we're going to compare, the results on game day for, shooting percentage and plus minus and turnover margin and all these things. And we're going to compare it, compared to game day -3, game day -2, game day -1 loads, game day -1 jumps, wellness data, and try to find if there's any, correlations we can find between certain ways that we structure training and success or failure, so to speak, on the court. So I think that that's kind of a new frontier. I'm excited about that. But that's not something that like the strength coach has time to really oversee a project like that.
Yeah, that was what I was gonna ask. I forgot about that. I
We
got,
talked about a lot.
I'm glad you brought this up. I
Yeah.
was gonna ask, like, since you're tracking all these load, I know that different coaches have different approach to practice, have different like methodology
Yeah.
or like their thoughts, their experience on how to prepare their athlete for a game, for a certain game. But as a sports scientist, like, do you think there's a this is stupid, but I'm gonna ask it anyway.
No, go ahead.
There's a perfect or like proper way to like using maybe GPS data player load or player load per minute to program the like the basketball training or soccer training for a game.
Um, I don't think there's I think there's more than one way to skin a cat. I think that there are wrong ways for sure. I think if you're doing if you're let's say for basketball, you're playing a basketball game load the day before a game. I don't think that that's good in any scenario, right? But there's different opinions when it comes to like football, for example. Like some college teams, they'll do Friday as a slow walkthrough for the Saturday game, and other schools do what they call Fast Friday, and they get the velocity up and they move around and they really get explosive. So I think that obviously context matters and volume matters no matter what you're choosing. But I think as long as we're making a concerted effort to, try to stack it in a way that makes sense, not only in the way that we like to structure the day and achieve the X's and O's in practice, but like physiologically has some kind of reasoning behind it. I don't think that there's any one specific way to go about it. Because I mean, you could really get into the depths of not only, how much volume or how much intensity or whatever they're doing, but you could get into time of day in training and time of meals around that and what time we travel and how early do we get there and how many days before do we arrive for road games and you could really get into the weeds of all that. And that's stuff that we try to have influence over. From our department, we really, again, try to think things through from every single angle we can and ask as many questions as possible that might generate good conversations. But no, so I guess that I'm saying I don't think there's any one specific model that couldn't possibly be improved that I've come across. Maybe there's a perfect one out there.
No, 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 no. Like I like where this is going, and this is actually like the I think the main thing. I kind of forgot why I didn't ask it at the first place, but this is kind of the main thing I want to ask you. I want you to like answer it because uh a lot of coaches have like those technology, like I mentioned, like they just look at those numbers and they feel like there's a certain way to do it. But like, and since like there's research out there, like, oh, you need to look at player load. Like, what
Mhm.
type of player load, like, how many percent, like, game day -1, game day -2 should be. But, like, in my experience, like, last year, me and Adam go to like 11 D1 Power 4 school, and they're like, I think half of them are like top 20 in the nation right now.
Yeah.
And we were lucky enough to like watch the practice, and each coach have different way to approach like the the skill training,
Mhm.
or like how are they gonna like they want to be fast, or like do they want to like shoot a lot of threes, different
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And the player load are like day and night.
Yeah.
Some teams they just accumulate a lot of player load,
Yeah.
and they're still successful.
Sure.
And some teams they're like the player load. If you look on the research, it's like perfect, but they're just not at the same level.
Yeah.
So I
I
think,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, I
So
think go ahead. Sorry.
I think that's why I kind of want you to like kind of want to ask you this about like the player load. So I'll say I'll ask it this way. Since there's like no perfect way, or
Mhm.
like there's not really one way to approach this. So what would what is your advice, or what would you recommend for like young strength coaches
Mhm.
to kind of approach these, and when they look at these like research, like how should they be looking at these stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a complex question. I think, again, we understand the principles of um, you know, fatigue and recovery, right? We understand training stimulus leads to fatigue. We know that certain magnitudes of that require different types of recovery and lengths of recovery. So I think that anytime that you're making any sort of concerted effort to taper into a competition, I think that that's a great place to start. So, however you want to structure your week, if that's a 2 game week and you're going to practice or you're going to be active 6 days with one off day, then I like a big, like, let's say it's a Wednesday, Sunday. Would that work? Yeah. So then Monday would be you could go kind of moderate high, Tuesday kind of low moderate, and then you have a game day, and then you have an off day and then you kind of repeat that over the next 3 day cycle. I think that that's a great place to start, whatever that looks like for you and your KPIs. I think that that's a good way to go about it. But some teams, they prefer to kind of go light on the first day back and then they kind of go medium and then they play the game and then they have the next off day or maybe they don't have an off day. But, I think that all that context is going to matter, looking at how many games you have ahead. Could we maybe go a little harder this week because we have 2 games, but we're going to have a full week to recover before the next game? Because then you might say, okay, we're going to hit it a little bit harder this week. We know it's going to be a little bit high, but we're going to make up for it next week. So taking all those factors into account is again untangling the Christmas lights. It's just part of it. But yeah, I think just kind of if it doesn't fit what you fit in the kind of learned throughout your schooling about the principles of adaptation and recovery, it's probably a red flag. So start there and then kind of start your conversations into what is the best way you can again sort of compromise and meet in the middle with what the coaches expect and what has to happen based on the other circumstances around you.
Yeah, and I like when you talk about this or you like when you answer my question, I like you kind of like bring everything into it. So it's like context matters.
Yeah,
It's not just like the sports itself. It's not just like practice. It's also like lifting
right.
and the way the coaches coach and how his experience, how his approach to like players. I like that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, again, this is just one piece of the puzzle. I know I obviously am in this because I'm passionate about it, and I think it's a very, very important piece. I think it's foundational, is what I would like to call it. So if you want the players to perform, what they need to, and the X's and O's that you guys spend all these time watching film and going through reps in practice, you want them to be able to perform that on game day. We need to make sure their bodies are right for it. So that's kind of the foundational piece for me, but it's not the only piece. And so, if I feel like, hey, I set a cap of 500 player load day before a game or whatever, and they're going to go 10 extra minutes because coach feels like they really need to get this defensive scheme down, then that might be a lot more impactful, even though they might be a couple percent more fatigued the next day. So, again, it's just one piece of the puzzle, and you got to be a little bit humble in that and meet in the middle as best you can.
Nice, nice. I guess that's all the question I have for you today. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. It's Ben Jones CSCS. I got a pretty common name, so I had to throw in CSCS in there. Um, yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I don't really do a whole lot on TikTok or YouTube or anything like that. One day I'll get my game together and I'll get a podcast like you, man. You get some big names on here, so I appreciate you thinking of me because I've seen some pretty good names on here.
No, I like your stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.